before anything had a name, before memory learned how to hold a moment, before time itself understood how to move forward, there was already something here. And that is where tonight begins. If you're drawn to slow journeys into the deepest layers of ancient history, stories meant to be felt rather than rushed, gently like this video and subscribe. It helps keep these quiet explorations alive. You can also tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Across different nights, different countries, different lives, many of us arrive at the same questions. Now dim the lights. Let the room grow still. Nothing here demands your attention, only your presence. Because what follows is not the popular story, not the version shaped by modern speculation, not the story of alien engineers, hidden planets, or cosmic empires. Tonight, we're listening to the oldest voices we have, pressed into clay more than 4,000 years ago, before later interpretations told us what they must mean. The Sumerian tablets speak quietly, but they speak clearly, and they tell us that before the Anunnaki, before divine councils and underworld judges, before gods were imagined with faces, families, and conflicts, there was something far older. The Sumerians did not imagine creation as a sudden explosion of light. They did not describe a triumphant beginning or a heroic act. They imagined water, not water as a thing, but water as possibility. They called it Nammu. Nammu was not a goddess in the later sense. She had no throne, no temples, no myths of jealousy or desire. She was the primordial sea, an endless, undivided expanse that existed before sky, before earth, before direction, before separation. In the Sumerian mind, water was not simply life-giving. It was formless potential. Everything that would ever exist was already there, but nothing had yet chosen a shape. To understand why the Sumerians began their story this way, we have to remember where they lived. Southern Mesopotamia was not a land of mountains or forests. It was flat, exposed, a place where survival depended entirely on water. The Tigris and Euphrates were not gentle rivers. They were unpredictable forces, sometimes nourishing, sometimes lethal. When they flooded at the right time, they deposited rich silt that made agriculture possible. When they flooded at the wrong time, they erased entire settlements. So when the Sumerians looked backward, past cities, past kings, past even the memory of farming, they did not imagine fire. They imagined drowning. Nammu represented a state before order, before boundaries, before fresh water and salt water were different things. She was not chaos in the sense of violence. She was undifferentiated existence. And crucially, she did not need a partner. In later mythologies, creation begins with division, sky and earth, male and female, light and dark. But in the oldest Sumerian layers, creation begins alone. Nammu contains within herself everything that will come. And then, without struggle, without war, without opposition, she gives birth. From her waters emerge An and Ki, heaven and earth, not as places yet, not as realms with borders, but as principles. They are pressed together, locked, indistinguishable. There is no space between them, no wind, no breath, no life. Everything exists, but nothing can move. This is the world before separation. The Sumerians describe this state carefully because it matters deeply to what comes next. Creation, in their view, is not about making something from nothing. It is about making space. And space requires violence. From the union of An and Kai comes Enlil, the lord of air, wind, and breath. His role is not gentle. He forces heaven upward. He presses earth downward. And between them, For the first time, there is room. This act, more than any other, marks the true beginning of the world. Because now there is sky, there is ground, and between them, there is atmosphere. A place where clouds can gather, where storms can move, where sound can travel, where life can breathe. This moment is not celebrated in the texts. It is necessary, not glorious. Order is born through rupture, and the Sumerians never forgot that. From here, the cosmos begins to fill, not all at once, not neatly. Gods are born into a world already shaped by separation. They inherit structure rather than invent it. This is critical because the Anunnaki, so often imagined as creators, are not present yet. They are not first. They are not architects. They come later, much later. Before them are gods tied directly to function. The sun that sees everything. The moon that measures time. The winds that destroy and nourish. Divinity is not personality yet. It is process. The world organizes itself through divine responsibility. And beneath the earth, below the fields, below the cities that do not yet exist, the waters remain, the Abzu, the cosmic deep, fresh water beneath the land. This is where Enki dwells, wise, subtle, restless. He does not rule from above, he works from below. And this choice matters, because the Sumerians believed the world was always resting on water. That order was never permanent. That chaos waited just beneath the surface. This belief shaped everything. Their flood myths, their fear of divine displeasure, their obsession with balance. Long before the Anunnaki judged the dead, long before kings ruled cities, long before humans were shaped from clay, the universe already existed, fragile, layered, held together by decisions that could be reversed. And tonight, we have only just stepped inside it. Before the first city was imagined, before bricks were stacked into walls, before human voices echoed across the plains, the Sumerians believed the world already existed in tension. Not chaos, not order, tension. Heaven had been lifted away from earth, but not gently. The separation was forceful, necessary, permanent. When Enlil drove the sky upward and pressed the earth downward, he did not create peace. He created space, and space once opened must be managed. This is the foundation most modern retellings miss. Creation was not a single event. It was an engineering problem. The universe, in Sumerian thought, was unstable by default. Above the earth, waters were held back only by structure. Below the earth, waters waited patiently. Everything solid existed between two floods. This is why water appears again and again in the oldest texts, not as symbolism, as threat. The Sumerians lived on flat land, no mountains, no natural barriers. When water rose, there was nowhere to flee. So when they imagined the beginning of existence, they imagined water everywhere, not as destruction, but as the original condition. Nammu, the primordial waters, was not a personality. She was a state, a condition where nothing had shape, nothing had boundaries, nothing had duration. From her, differentiation emerged: heaven, earth, air. Not because the universe wanted beauty, but because without division, nothing could function. The act of separation did not end danger. It merely delayed it. Because once space exists, it can collapse. This is why the Sumerian cosmos required constant supervision, not worship, maintenance. Enlil ruled the air not as a king, but as a regulator. Wind, breath, storm, pressure. If the air failed, the sky would fall. If the air raged, cities would break. Order depended on moderation. Below, Enki governed the Abzu, the deep fresh water beneath the earth. This was not an underworld of the dead. It was a reservoir, a vast, unseen system feeding rivers, wells, and springs. The Sumerians noticed something simple and terrifying. No matter where you dug, eventually you hit water. From this observation came theology. The land floated. It was not anchored. And if the balance between surface and depth failed, everything would drown. Enki was not wise because he knew secrets. He was wise because he understood systems, flow, pressure, distribution. When canals worked, life flourished. When they failed, famine followed. This was not metaphor. It was daily experience. So the gods were not distant creators. They were infrastructure managers. This is why the earliest gods do not resemble later human-like deities. They are forces with responsibility, and responsibility produces labor. The texts are explicit about this. Before humans existed, the gods worked. They dug channels. They shaped land. They stabilized zones. The cosmos did not run itself, and eventually, the labor became unbearable. Not because the gods were weak, but because the system demanded constant input. This is the moment where modern interpretations leap ahead. They insert rebellion. They insert advanced beings. They insert dramatic conflict. But the Sumerian tablets describe something quieter: exhaustion. The gods complained, not in anger, in fatigue. They were maintaining a world that never rested. And that is when a question emerged that would change everything. How do you preserve order without performing every task yourself? The answer was not dominance. It was delegation. But delegation requires workers, and workers require form. This is where the idea of humanity begins. Not as destiny, but as solution. Not yet as bodies, not yet as names, as a role. Before humans could exist, however, the system had to be refined further, because creating workers without limits would only amplify instability. Time had to be structured. Cycles had to be enforced. Day and night were not automatic. They were assigned. The moon's return defined months. The sun's path defined seasons. These cycles regulated agriculture, which regulated survival. Without predictability, labor was meaningless. This is why celestial bodies mattered so deeply. Not for astrology, for scheduling. Life depended on rhythm, and rhythm depended on consistency. The gods became guardians of cycles. Each domain received oversight: water, grain, storm, birth, death. This was not hierarchy for glory. It was hierarchy for containment. Nowhere was this clearer than in Eridu. Eridu was not just the first city, it was the prototype, built near the ancient shoreline, where land met sea, where fresh water met salt, where stability was always at risk. The Sumerians believed Eridu stood above the Abzu, that Enki's temple marked a thin place between surface and depth. To enter that temple was to stand above creation's pressure point. This is why Eridu mattered before kingship, before law, before writing. It represented the principle that civilization must be built where danger is greatest. Only there could balance be tested and maintained. This is the world before humanity, a world already complex, already strained, already dangerous. Humans did not arrive into emptiness. They arrived into a system that desperately needed relief, but relief would come at a cost. Because once workers exist, noise exists, movement exists, growth exists, and growth, unchecked, always threatens balance. That realization had not yet arrived, but it was already waiting, just beneath the surface. The Sumerian texts never describe the creation of humanity as a miracle. There is no moment of awe, no divine celebration, no declaration that something precious has been made. Instead, the language is practical, almost indifferent. Humanity is introduced the way a tool is introduced, because a need has been identified. The gods had already done the difficult work. Heaven was separated from earth. Water was regulated. Cycles were stabilized. But maintaining this balance required effort, and effort required hands. This is where later traditions misunderstand the tone entirely. Humans were not created because the gods desired companionship. They were created because the system was unsustainable. The gods were tired, not emotionally, structurally. Their labor was endless, and the world showed no sign of stabilizing on its own. In Sumerian thought, this was not a moral problem. It was an engineering failure. Too much maintenance was required from too few operators. So a new class of beings was proposed. Beings that could dig, carry, maintain. Beings that could take over repetitive tasks without destabilizing the cosmic hierarchy. The material chosen was not accidental. Clay. The same substance bricks were made from. The same substance canals cut through. The same substance floods reduced cities into. Clay was abundant, malleable, replaceable. Humanity was shaped from what the world already produced in excess. This detail is uncomfortable for modern readers, but it is central to the Sumerian worldview. Humans were not rare. They were manufacturable. The texts do not dwell on the act itself. They move quickly from formation to assignment. Work is mentioned immediately. Labor is not a punishment. It is the purpose. Humans dig canals so gods do not have to. Humans tend fields so order persists. Humans perform rituals so cycles remain intact. This is not slavery in the modern sense. It is delegation within a system that values function over feeling. The Sumerians did not imagine dignity as freedom. They imagined dignity as usefulness. A life mattered if it contributed to balance. This is why kingship mattered. This is why law mattered. This is why ritual accuracy mattered. Everything fed the system. And for a time, it worked. Humanity multiplied. Cities expanded. Agriculture flourished. The gods rested. This is where the story becomes dangerous, because success carries its own instability. The humans were effective, too effective. They multiplied faster than expected. They built larger settlements. They altered the landscape. Canals grew deeper. Fields spread wider. The noise began to rise. Noise in the Sumerian sense was not just sound. It was activity, motion, disruption, presence. The air that Enlil governed filled with human movement. This mattered because the cosmos was delicately balanced. More humans meant more water diverted, more land altered, more strain placed on systems never designed for unlimited growth. This is the moment where later readers expect rebellion. They expect humans to defy the gods. But the tablets do not describe rebellion. They describe overperformance. Humanity did not resist its role. It exceeded it. And excess, in Sumerian thought, was the greatest danger of all. The gods did not react immediately. They attempted correction. Minor disasters appear in the texts: crop failures, disease, localized floods. These were not punishments. They were adjustments. Attempts to reduce pressure, to slow growth, to restore balance without destroying the system. And yet, humanity persisted, because once growth begins, it resists restraint. This is one of the most sophisticated observations in ancient literature. The Sumerians understood something civilizations still struggle with. Growth does not stop voluntarily. It must be limited. When adjustment fails, escalation follows. This is when the divine council is convened. Not a dramatic courtroom, a planning session. Enlil speaks first. The noise has become unbearable. The air is overloaded. The balance is failing. The system cannot sustain this level of activity. Others hesitate because they understand what reduction requires. Reduction means loss. Loss means instability of a different kind. Enki understands this better than anyone. He governs water. He knows what happens when too much is released. But he also knows what happens when pressure is not relieved. The decision is not framed as justice. It is framed as necessity. The world must be reset, and water is the only force capable of doing that. This is why the flood is not an act of rage. It is a return to origin, a controlled collapse. The flood dissolves cities, erases canals, ends noise. For a brief moment, the world resembles its earliest state. Water everywhere. Silence. Potential. The gods are not triumphant. They are cautious. They wait. When the waters recede, something unexpected happens. They feel hunger. Because without humans, the system lacks caretakers. Ritual ceases. Offerings stop. The gods realize something crucial. They need humanity, but not without limits. This is the most important realization in the entire mythic cycle. Humanity will continue, but changed. Mortality will be enforced. Lifespans will be shortened. Population will be controlled. Noise will be reduced. This is not punishment. It is design revision. Humanity version 2 is deployed. More fragile, more limited, more manageable. And with mortality introduced permanently, something new becomes necessary. Someone must oversee endings. Someone must enforce limits. Someone must confirm when a life is complete. This is where the Anunnaki truly emerge, not as creators, not as engineers, but as judges of completion. They are not introduced with spectacle. They simply take their seats. From this moment on, death is no longer accidental. It is regulated. The Anunnaki preside over that regulation. This is where history begins. Because once death is fixed, time becomes meaningful, and meaning requires memory, and memory requires writing, which is where the next segment takes us. The introduction of death was not dramatic. There was no thunder, no proclamation carved into the sky, no announcement that humanity would now suffer. In the Sumerian imagination, death entered the world the same way work did, quietly, functionally, as a necessary adjustment. Before this moment, time itself behaved differently. The antediluvian world did not experience urgency. Kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, not because the Sumerians were bad at counting, but because time had not yet become restrictive. Life unfolded slowly. Generations blurred together. The boundary between divine and human was thin enough that continuity mattered more than endings. But once the flood occurred, that continuity shattered. The old world was gone. The new one required limits. Mortality was not introduced as cruelty. It was introduced as containment. A human life would now have an endpoint. Not because humans had failed, but because unlimited duration created unlimited accumulation, and accumulation destabilized the system. This is where fate enters the Sumerian worldview in its mature form. Fate was not destiny in the modern sense. It was not a personal narrative. It was not a story about fulfillment or purpose. Fate was a boundary condition, a line beyond which existence could not extend. To enforce this boundary, authority was required, and authority requires structure. This is where the Anunnaki take shape, not suddenly, not violently, but formally. They are seated. That phrase appears again and again. The Anunnaki sit. They do not roam. They do not descend. They preside. Their power is judicial, not creative. They do not make life. They confirm its conclusion. This distinction is crucial, and it is exactly where modern misinterpretations collapse. Creators act at beginnings. Judges act at thresholds. The Anunnaki belong to the threshold. They are stationed at the point where life transitions into something else. Their domain is not the sky. It is not the earth. It is the crossing. In Sumerian cosmology, the universe is layered. Above is An, sky, remote, unreachable. Below is Ki, earth, cultivated, inhabited. Beneath that lies Kur, the underworld, inevitable. The Anunnaki do not rule An. They do not govern Ki. They arbitrate Kur. They determine who enters, and how, and when. This function makes them terrifying, but not malicious. They are not villains. They are not saviors. They are administrators. This is why Inanna, despite her power, must submit to them. Her descent into the underworld is not a rebellion. It is a demonstration. Even gods are subject to structure. When Inanna descends, she passes through gates. Each gate removes an attribute: crown, jewelry, authority. This is not punishment, it is equalization. At the boundary, all distinctions dissolve. This is the principle the Anunnaki enforce. No identity crosses intact. No status survives the threshold. This is death, as the Sumerians understood it. Not annihilation, reduction, simplification, return. The Anunnaki do not kill. They confirm. They look, and their gaze is final. This gaze, the eyes of death, is not metaphorical. It represents recognition. Once something is fully seen, it cannot persist. Unobserved things can continue indefinitely. Observed, things must resolve. This is why the Anunnaki are feared. They finalize. Their authority emerges fully after humanity's second creation. This timing matters. They are not involved in making humans. They are involved in limiting humans, which means their rise coincides with history. History only exists where endings exist. Before mortality, there was memory, but no urgency. After mortality, time becomes precious. Lineage matters, legacy matters, records matter. This is where writing becomes inevitable. The Sumerians did not invent writing to tell stories. They invented it to track loss, grain owed, labor counted, lives measured. Every tablet is an admission that something ends. This is why early writing is administrative. It exists to manage finite resources, including human ones. This is also why kingship changes after the flood. Kings are no longer semi-divine beings spanning millennia. They are mortal administrators. Their reigns shrink. Their achievements must be recorded quickly. They must justify their authority, and authority itself must be justified. This leads to law. Law exists because mortality exists. A rule that applies forever is meaningless. A rule that applies for a lifetime matters. The gods now rule through systems rather than presence. The Anunnaki embody this shift. They do not intervene. They do not warn. They do not explain. They sit. And waiting becomes the human condition. Every life moves toward that seated assembly. Every story ends there. This is why the Sumerians did not imagine a joyful afterlife. They did not romanticize death. They did not pretend it was a reward. The underworld is dull, dusty, gray. Existence continues, but without ambition, without progress, without expansion. It is stasis, which is exactly what the system requires beyond a certain point. Movement belongs to the living. Stillness belongs to the dead. The Anunnaki enforce this division. They are not cruel. They are precise. And precision is terrifying. This is also why modern ancient astronaut narratives fail so badly here. Aliens mining gold have motives. Judges do not. Administrators do not. The Anunnaki do not need. They enforce. They are the price of continuity. Without them, The world would either stagnate in immortality or collapse in excess. The Sumerians understood this trade-off deeply. Life requires limits. Limits require authority. Authority requires impartiality. Impartiality requires distance. The Anunnaki are distant, not because they are cold, but because closeness would compromise judgment. This is where the story turns from cosmology to civilization. Because once death is structured, humans behave differently. They plan, they hoard, they fear, they remember, and they seek ways to escape. Which leads directly to the next movement in the story. Because the Sumerians did not accept mortality quietly. They negotiated. They prayed. They searched for loopholes. They sought immortality. And one king more than any other embodied that search. Not before the Anunnaki, but under their gaze. Gilgamesh was not searching for power. He already had it. He was not searching for legitimacy. He ruled. He was not searching for divine favor. He was 2/3 divine by birth. What Gilgamesh searched for was continuation, and that alone tells you everything about the world he lived in. By the time Gilgamesh ruled Uruk, the rules were already set. Death was normal. The Anunnaki were established. The flood was memory, not threat. Civilization had resumed its rhythm under new constraints. People were born knowing they would die. Kings ruled knowing they would be forgotten, and gods ruled knowing they would endure. This imbalance was no longer hidden. It was felt. Gilgamesh feels it first, not as philosophy, but as loss. Enkidu dies. That is the pivot. Before Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh is reckless, cruel, excessive. After Enkidu's death, he becomes quiet, obsessive, focused. Grief in Sumerian literature is not emotional exposition. It is behavioral change. Gilgamesh stops ruling, stops enjoying, stops sleeping. He looks at Enkidu's body and waits for something to reverse. It doesn't. The Anunnaki do not intervene. No god appears to explain. No ritual restores breath. This is the first time a semi-divine king confronts the finality enforced by the seated judges, and he refuses to accept it. This refusal is not framed as arrogance. It is framed as human. Gilgamesh becomes afraid, not of enemies, not of rebellion, of becoming what Enkidu has become: dust, silence, stasis. The epic makes this explicit. He touches Enkidu's body. He watches decay. He understands that even divine blood does not exempt him. This is when the story shifts from myth to existential inquiry. Gilgamesh sets out not to conquer, but to escape. He searches for Utnapishtim, not for wisdom, not for blessing, but for the secret that allowed one human to bypass the Anunnaki entirely. Utnapishtim is dangerous as a figure, not because he is powerful, but because he proves the system is not absolute. He is the exception that destabilizes the rule. This is why he is hidden, placed beyond the edge of the world, removed from society. Immortality cannot be socialized. It must be isolated. If many escape death, death loses authority. And if death loses authority, fate collapses. So Gilgamesh must travel beyond civilization, beyond fields, beyond cities, beyond law. This journey mirrors a descent, not into the underworld, but into pre-human space. Mountains, deserts, waters that cannot be crossed by ordinary means. This is symbolic, but also literal. The path to immortality requires leaving the ordered world. Gilgamesh is warned repeatedly. Every encounter tells him to stop. Siduri, the tavern keeper, tells him plainly, "You will not find what you are looking for. Enjoy life. Eat, drink, love." This is not advice. It is doctrine. It is the post-flood worldview distilled. Life is finite, meaning exists inside the boundary, not beyond it. Gilgamesh rejects this, which is why the epic is tragic even when it succeeds, because he reaches Utnapishtim. He hears the story, he learns the truth, and the truth is devastating. Utnapishtim did not earn immortality. He did not discover it. He was granted it once, accidentally, because the gods themselves made a mistake. And they corrected that mistake immediately by ensuring it would never happen again. This is critical. Immortality is not a technology. It is not a formula. It is not a secret that can be stolen. It is an administrative anomaly, a clerical error in the cosmic system. Utnapishtim survived because Enki bypassed protocol. The Anunnaki were overruled indirectly, and the result terrified the gods. Never again. This is why Utnapishtim cannot help Gilgamesh. He does not possess a method. He possesses a status, and status cannot be transferred. Even the plant of rejuvenation is a lie. It restores youth, not permanence, and it is stolen anyway, by a snake, not by a god, not by a demon, by nature itself. Renewal belongs to cycles, not individuals. The snake sheds skin. The human does not. This is not punishment. It is structure. Gilgamesh returns empty-handed, but changed. He does not overthrow death. He does not expose the Anunnaki. He does not escape fate. What he gains is acceptance through memory. He inspects the walls of Uruk. He measures them. He records them. This is not pride. This is strategy. If the body ends, the name must endure. This is the compromise humanity makes. Not immortality, legacy. Writing becomes sacred here. Because writing is continuity without life, a name carved into clay persists without breath. This is the only way humans can defy the Anunnaki without confronting them. They cannot avoid judgment, but they can outlast forgetting. This is why Sumerian culture is obsessed with lists, king lists, offering lists, genealogies. Records are survival mechanisms. This is also why the Anunnaki never object. They govern death, not memory. Memory belongs to the living. As long as it does not disrupt order, it is permitted. Gilgamesh's failure becomes humanity's blueprint. Do not escape death. Build something that survives you. Cities, stories, systems. This is civilization as a response to mortality. And this is why the Anunnaki remain untouched. They are not challenged. They are accepted. Their silence becomes normal. Their presence becomes abstract. They fade from daily fear into cosmic background. This is how gods lose immediacy, not through defeat, but through distance. As societies stabilize, fear shifts from death itself to injustice, famine, war. The Anunnaki recede into theology. They remain real, but no longer central, which is exactly what the system requires. A visible judge disrupts life. An invisible one stabilizes it. By the time later cultures inherit Sumerian myths, the Anunnaki are already shadows, names without rituals, judges without narratives. This is the moment where misunderstanding begins, when later readers encounter fragments without context, when modern interpreters fill silence with speculation. But the silence is intentional. The Anunnaki were never meant to be dramatic. They were meant to be inevitable. After Gilgamesh returned to Uruk, something subtle but irreversible had happened. Not in the heavens, not in the underworld, but in the human mind. For the first time in recorded literature, a king had completed a journey to the edge of existence and returned without divine reward. No immortality, no exemption, no loophole carved into fate, only knowledge and restraint. The gods did not punish him for asking. They did not silence him. They did not erase his name. They simply let him return unchanged. That silence is more important than any divine speech, because silence signals completion. The cosmic system no longer needs adjustment. From this point onward, Sumerian texts begin to change tone. Creation myths become background. Flood stories become precedent. The Anunnaki become static. They do not vanish, but they stop acting. And when gods stop acting, humans begin compensating. This is the true beginning of human-centered time. Not secular time, not disbelief, but responsibility. The Anunnaki still sit in judgment. Kur still receives the dead. Fate is still fixed. But daily life no longer orients around divine interruption. Instead, it orients around prediction, calendars, contracts, law. This shift is subtle but visible in the tablets. Earlier texts speak of gods deciding outcomes. Later texts speak of procedures. The MI, once animated divine forces, become codified practices. Rituals become standardized. Offerings become scheduled. Temples become bureaucratic. This is not decline. It is stabilization. The gods are not withdrawing because humans are rebellious. They are withdrawing because the system now functions. In early Sumerian cosmology, divine proximity was dangerous. Too much God meant catastrophe. Floods, plagues, cosmic resets. Distance is safety. The Anunnaki embody this principle perfectly. They are not gods of intervention. They are gods of consequence. They do not act until action is over. They judge only after life concludes, which means daily existence must be managed without them. This is why kingship evolves. Early kings are divine hybrids. Later kings are administrators. They no longer claim to be gods. They claim to be chosen. Chosen implies distance. Authority without embodiment. A king does not become divine. He represents divine order. This matters. Because representation allows replacement, and replacement allows continuity. When a divine king dies, the system collapses. When a human king dies, the system persists. This is resilience. This is why Sumerian civilization outlives its myths. As gods retreat into abstraction, institutions advance. Law replaces decree. Contract replaces oath. Witness replaces miracle. The Anunnaki still validate fate, but fate now operates through systems. If you break a contract, punishment is immediate. If you commit injustice, the sun god sees. If you die, the Anunnaki judge. No appeals, no drama, just consequence. This worldview is colder than later religious systems, but it is brutally consistent, and consistency creates endurance. Which brings us to writing. Writing is not neutral in Sumerian culture. It is sacred precisely because gods no longer speak directly. Clay becomes memory. Memory becomes authority. Authority becomes reality. The tablet does not argue. It does not forget. It does not negotiate. Once impressed, it remains. This permanence mimics the gods. In a world where divine speech has faded, written record becomes divine proxy. This is why scribes are sacred. Not because they are artists, but because they preserve order. The Anunnaki judge the dead. Scribes judge the living. Through records, through accounts, through names fixed in clay. This is why false writing is a crime. To alter record is to disrupt fate, and disruption invites divine attention. The Anunnaki are patient, but they are not tolerant. They wait. They do not warn. This produces a culture obsessed with correctness, precision, procedure, not morality, correctness. A person can be cruel and still righteous. A person can be kind and still doomed. What matters is alignment with order. This is alien to modern thinking, but it is internally coherent. The universe is not good. It is structured, and structure must be respected. As centuries pass, the Anunnaki fade further. Later Akkadian texts mention them less frequently. Their names persist, but their narratives do not expand. They are not heroes, they are not villains, they are endpoints. This makes them boring to storytellers and irresistible to modern misinterpretation, because modern audiences crave agency, action, technology, drama. The Anunnaki provide none of this, so they are rewritten. But the original texts never needed rewriting. They needed patience. The Anunnaki were never meant to explain the world. They were meant to end explanations. Why did this person die? Why was this king cut short? Why does fate feel arbitrary? Because judgment exists, not because justice does. This is the hard truth of Sumerian cosmology. Justice is procedural, not moral. The Anunnaki do not weigh goodness, they weigh completion. Did you live? Then you die. Did you die? Then you are judged. Judgment is not reward or punishment. It is classification. This is why even heroes fear the underworld. There is no escape, no heaven, no reunion, only endurance through name. Which brings us to a crucial realization. The Sumerians did not fear the Anunnaki because they were tyrants. They feared them because they were correct, immovable, final. There is no pleading with a system that does not listen, only preparation. This is why funerary rituals matter, why descendants must remember, why offerings must be maintained. The dead do not need love. They need continuity. Without offerings, the dead weaken, not morally, existentially. Memory sustains presence, and presence is the only thing that survives death. This belief is terrifying, but it is consistent, and it produces a civilization obsessed with lineage. Names matter more than bodies. Children matter more than happiness. Legacy matters more than comfort. This is not cruel. It is survival logic. Now pause and notice something important. At no point does this system require extraterrestrials. No technology, no genetic engineering, no visitors from the sky. Everything functions without it. In fact, introducing aliens breaks the logic. Aliens would introduce intervention, choice, favoritism. But Sumerian cosmology rejects favoritism. Even gods are bound. Even Enki must trick. Even Inanna must die. This is not a universe built for exception. It is built for inevitability. And inevitability is not exciting, which is why it is misunderstood. As time moves forward, later cultures inherit fragments. Babylonians reinterpret. Assyrians militarize. Hebrews moralize. Greeks humanize. Romans politicize. But beneath all of it lies the Sumerian foundation. A world where existence is temporary, order is absolute, and memory is resistance. The Anunnaki do not arrive. They do not depart. They simply remain, watching the end of every story. Long after the Sumerian cities fell silent, the tablets remained, not intact, not complete, but persistent, buried beneath collapsed temples, sealed inside ruined libraries, broken, scattered, copied, mistranscribed. This is where the story begins to change, not in ancient times, but much later. The Sumerians did not vanish suddenly. They were absorbed. Their language faded first. Akkadian replaced Sumerian as the spoken tongue, but Sumerian did not die. It became sacred. A language no one spoke, but everyone copied. This matters, because once a language becomes ritual instead of living speech, meaning begins to drift. Scribes copied texts they no longer fully felt. They preserved words without inhabiting the worldview behind them. The gods remained. The names survived, but context thinned. This is when interpretation begins. The Anunnaki, once a functional part of a complete cosmology, start to look strange when isolated. 7 judges, born of heaven, dwelling below. Without the full system around them, they feel ominous, powerful, other. And humans have always filled gaps with imagination. The Babylonians inherited Sumerian myths, but they reorganized them. They elevated Marduk. They reframed creation as conflict. Chaos became an enemy, not a condition. Tiamat was no longer primordial water. She became a monster. Violence replaced separation. Order was no longer structural. It was political. This shift is subtle but massive. In Sumerian thought, creation is administrative. In Babylonian thought, creation is conquest. And when creation becomes conquest, gods become warriors. This recenters attention. The Anunnaki, once quiet judges, are now part of a cosmic power struggle. Still not aliens, but no longer neutral. Later Assyrian culture pushes this further. Gods become national, militarized, violent, protective of empire. Divine favor becomes conditional. Victory proves righteousness. Defeat implies abandonment. This is the beginning of moralization, a concept alien to early Sumerian theology. By the time Hebrew scribes encounter Mesopotamian stories during exile, the material is already transformed. They encounter flood myths, creation narratives, divine councils, but they reinterpret them through a radically different lens. Monotheism collapses the pantheon. The divine assembly becomes angels. Judgment becomes moral. Fate becomes covenant. The underworld becomes punishment. And immortality becomes conditional reward. This is not theft. It is adaptation. But something is lost. The Anunnaki cannot survive this framework. They are either erased or transformed. Judges become angels. Fate becomes sin. Order becomes law. And silence becomes absence. Fast forward again. Greek thinkers encounter Near Eastern myths indirectly. They humanize gods. They dramatize conflict. They turn cosmic principles into personalities. Zeus argues. Hades rules. Fate becomes negotiable. Even death can be cheated. This is entertainment theology. Powerful, memorable, but fundamentally incompatible with Sumerian inevitability. Then Rome institutionalizes it. Then Christianity moralizes it. Then Islam abstracts it. By this point, the original Sumerian worldview is gone, not erased, but buried under layers of reinterpretation. The Anunnaki survive only as names, detached from function, detached from system. This is the danger point. Because names without systems invite fantasy. Now enter modernity. Tablets are rediscovered in the 19th century. Languages are decoded. Fragments emerge. But the worldview does not come with them. Scholars reconstruct cautiously, but popular culture does not wait. Fragments like those of royal blood, those who decreed fate, those who came from heaven, are ripped from grammar and repurposed. Heaven becomes space. Blood becomes DNA. Decree becomes technology. This is not translation. This is projection. Modern readers see what they are primed to see. A technological civilization imagines technology. An age obsessed with aliens imagines visitors. A culture distrustful of authority imagines suppressed truth. The Anunnaki become a mirror, not of ancient belief, but of modern anxiety. Ancient astronauts offer comfort. They explain complexity without responsibility. If aliens built civilization, humans didn't have to. If gods engineered us, we are not accountable. If knowledge was given, not earned, failure is understandable. This is psychologically appealing, but it collapses under scrutiny, because the Sumerian texts do not support it. They never describe technology. They never describe travel between planets. They never describe machines. They describe roles, judges, administrators, deities bound by order. They describe a universe obsessed with procedure, not innovation. The Anunnaki never do things. They decide outcomes. That distinction is everything. Modern mythmakers collapse that distinction. They turn decision into action, judgment into intervention. They turn metaphysical structure into science fiction. But the original texts resist this. They are stubbornly uncinematic. No lasers, no engines, no starscapes, just clay, water, breath, dust, death. This is why they feel unsettling when read properly. They do not flatter humanity. They do not elevate curiosity. They do not promise transcendence. They insist on limits, and limits are uncomfortable. So the Anunnaki are rewritten, made into villains, or creators, or overlords. Anything but what they were, because what they were is harder. They were the reminder that existence ends, and that order does not care. This reinterpretation accelerates in the 20th century. Television, books, pseudo-scholarship. Ancient astronauts become entertainment. Speculation becomes certainty. Certainty becomes belief. Belief becomes identity. And now correcting it feels like attack. But correction is not dismissal. It is restoration. The real Sumerian story is not less interesting. It is more demanding. It asks the listener to accept no cosmic rescue, no divine favoritism, no escape from death, no moral universe, only structure, only continuity, only memory, and the courage to live meaningfully inside limits. This is why the Anunnaki must remain judges. If they become saviors, the system collapses. If they become invaders, the worldview breaks. They are not characters, they are boundaries. And boundaries are not meant to be exciting. They are meant to be final. The most difficult idea in the Sumerian worldview is not death. It is acceptance, not resignation, not despair. Acceptance as structure. The ancient Mesopotamian mind did not ask whether the universe was fair. It asked whether the universe was stable. Fairness implies morality. Stability implies survival. Those are not the same question. For the Sumerians, survival depended on understanding limits and not violating them. Floods came whether people deserved them or not. Drought followed obedience as often as rebellion. Disease struck kings and laborers alike. The gods did not explain themselves. They did not apologize. They did not adjust the system for individual suffering. And yet the Sumerians did not rebel against this. They organized around it. This is the key difference between ancient and modern cosmologies. Modern belief systems, religious or secular, are uncomfortable with inevitability. They seek escape routes. Ancient systems sought alignment. To the Sumerian, the question was never, how do we defeat death? It was, how do we live knowing death is unavoidable? That question produces very different civilizations. The Anunnaki exist precisely because limits exist. They are the guardians of boundary. They do not enforce morality. They enforce finality, which is why they are terrifying and boring at the same time. They do not negotiate. They do not reward cleverness. They do not care about intention. They care about completion. A life lived ends. That ending is processed. That is all. In such a system, meaning cannot be postponed. There is no afterlife reward, no eternal correction, no deferred justice. Meaning must occur inside life, or not at all. This creates urgency, but not ambition. Urgency toward continuity, not conquest. This is why Sumerian culture values lineage, record, ritual, city, law. These are not spiritual achievements. They are defenses against erasure. A person dies, a family continues. A name persists. A city outlives generations. A A tablet remembers. This is immortality reframed. Not eternal life, but extended relevance. The Anunnaki permit this. They do not interfere. They do not punish memory. They only terminate breath. Modern culture, by contrast, is deeply hostile to limits. We pursue indefinite extension, life extension, digital immortality, cosmic expansion. We imagine leaving Earth, leaving the body, leaving time. This impulse is not scientific. It is theological. It is the rejection of inevitability. And this is why the Anunnaki are reimagined as aliens. Aliens represent escape without transcendence. Technology replaces ritual. Travel replaces acceptance. Engineering replaces alignment. But the cost is coherence. Once limits are denied, meaning becomes unstable. If death is optional, life loses weight. If fate is editable, responsibility diffuses. If survival is guaranteed, continuity loses urgency. The Sumerians understood this intuitively, which is why their myths are quiet, measured, unheroic. No one defeats death. No one conquers the underworld. No one dismantles fate. Even gods submit. Even Inanna dies. Even Enki tricks, but does not overturn. The Anunnaki sit. They wait. They judge. And they never change. This constancy allows everything else to function. The flood resets the world, but not the system. Kings rise and fall, but not the order. Cities collapse, but the structure remains. This is why Sumerian civilization leaves such a deep imprint. It does not promise salvation. It offers durability, and durability outlasts hope. When later cultures encounter Sumerian myths, they misread restraint as ignorance, silence as absence, limits as lack. But restraint is not ignorance. It is discipline, and discipline creates survival. This is why the Sumerians did not speculate wildly about the cosmos. They did not imagine countless worlds. They did not search for others like themselves. Their universe was already crowded, with gods, spirits, judges, ancestors. Adding more entities did not solve anything. It diluted responsibility. Meaning did not come from discovery. It came from maintenance. Maintain the canal. Maintain the field. Maintain the offering. Maintain the record. Maintain the name. The Anunnaki ensured that nothing lasted forever, which made maintenance sacred. This worldview does not scale well to modern imagination. We want climax, resolution, victory. But Sumerian myth ends where modern myth begins, with acceptance. This is why Gilgamesh ends measuring walls, why Utnapishtim withdraws, why Enkidu dies, why the flood survivors do not inherit power, why the Anunnaki remain unchanged. Because the story is not about overcoming the universe. It is about finding a way to live inside it. And that may be the most alien idea of all. If you read the Sumerian texts carefully, one truth becomes unavoidable. The Sumerians did not primarily fear the gods. They feared disorder. The gods were not chaos. They were the last defense against it. This is a crucial distinction that modern readers often miss. Enlil could destroy cities. Inanna could unleash war. Enki could flood the world through clever negligence, but none of these were random. Every divine action occurred inside a framework. There were assemblies. There were decrees. There were consequences. The true terror for the Sumerian mind was not divine anger. It was cosmic collapse. A world without boundaries. A world where canals failed, where calendars broke, where rituals no longer worked, where names were forgotten. That was fear. Because without order, survival was impossible. The Sumerian landscape made this fear rational. Southern Mesopotamia was not forgiving land. It was flat, exposed, and unstable. Floods could erase harvests overnight. Droughts could last years. Salt could poison soil permanently. Cities existed only through constant effort. Canals had to be dredged, embankments repaired, fields rotated. Nothing was self-sustaining. So the universe was imagined the same way, not as a benevolent system that cared, but as a fragile balance that required maintenance. The gods did not exist to comfort humans. They existed to stabilize reality. And the Anunnaki were the final stabilizers. They ensured that endings happened, because endless continuation was itself a form of chaos. Imagine a world where no one died. Population would grow unchecked. Resources would collapse. Noise would never cease. The flood myth makes this explicit. Humanity was destroyed not for your wickedness, but for excess, too many voices, too much presence, too much life. The gods did not punish sin. They corrected imbalance. This is uncomfortable for modern readers. We want justice. They wanted equilibrium, which is why the Anunnaki are judges, not executioners. They do not kill the living. They process the dead. They ensure turnover. They ensure silence returns. They are not evil. They are necessary. In Sumerian thought, even suffering had function. Disease limited numbers. Infant mortality controlled growth. War redistributed power. Old age cleared space. These are brutal truths, but they are internally consistent. A world without limits collapses. So fear was not directed upward. It was directed outward. Toward flood. Toward famine. Toward forgetting ritual. Toward breaking contract. Toward losing favor through negligence. Negligence mattered more than rebellion, because rebellion was visible. Negligence was slow. A canal ignored would silt up. A ritual skipped would weaken protection. An offering forgotten would thin presence. A name not spoken would fade, and faded things did not return. This is why ancestor veneration mattered. The dead did not ascend. They lingered weakly. They depended on the living. Neglecting the dead was dangerous, not because ghosts haunted, but because the boundary between order and disorder thinned. The underworld was not feared because it was painful. It was feared because it was irreversible. Once a soul passed fully into Kur, there was no return, no message, no correction, no reconciliation. Finality terrified humans far more than judgment. Judgment at least acknowledged existence. Oblivion erased it. The Anunnaki prevented oblivion from spreading upward. They kept death contained, processed, filed, closed. This bureaucratic imagery is not accidental. The Sumerians invented bureaucracy because they needed it, and they projected it onto the cosmos. The universe worked because someone kept records. Someone tracked fates. Someone ensured endings occurred. This is the Anunnaki's role, and it explains why they are rarely described visually. No statues dominate temples. No epic focuses on their personalities. They are not worshipped the way Inanna is. They are respected, avoided, acknowledged. You do not pray to a judge. You prepare for judgment. That preparation shaped daily life. Contracts were sacred. Oaths binding. Witnesses crucial. Truth mattered not because lying was immoral, but because falsehood destabilized systems. A false measurement could ruin trade. A false oath could unravel trust. A false record could erase lineage. These were existential threats, which is why writing becomes sacred law. A tablet did not forget. It did not embellish. It did not forgive. It preserved. And preservation was survival. The gods demanded offerings not out of hunger, but to maintain presence. A god without offerings weakened. A weak god could not protect. A city without protection fell. So ritual was not devotion, it was infrastructure. This worldview is harsh, but it is coherent, and coherence produces endurance. The Anunnaki were never the focus of fear. They were the reminder that fear had limits too. Fear ended at death. After death came processing, and then stillness. That certainty allowed life to proceed, without constant terror, without divine unpredictability. The system was brutal, but it was reliable. And reliability is the foundation of civilization. This is why Sumerian thought survived conquest, language death, and cultural replacement. Because its core assumptions were functional, they did not require belief. They required participation. You did not need to love the gods. You needed to respect structure. The Anunnaki demanded nothing more and nothing less. Every age reshapes the past into something it can tolerate. The Sumerians shaped the cosmos into something survivable. Modern humanity reshapes it into something escapable. This difference explains almost every misunderstanding surrounding the Anunnaki. The ancient world accepted limits because it had to. The modern world resists them because it can delay them. Medicine extends life. Technology reduces hardship. Information weakens mystery. And yet, death remains, which makes it intolerable. When limits cannot be removed, they are reinterpreted. This is where the Anunnaki re-enter the story, not as judges, not as administrators, but as agents, because agents can be resisted. Judges cannot. If the Anunnaki are aliens, then death is an accident. If they engineered us, then fate is imposed, not intrinsic. If they altered history, then responsibility shifts outward. This is comforting. It externalizes inevitability. It reframes mortality as sabotage rather than structure. But the Sumerian worldview does not permit this escape. Death is not inflicted. It is required. The Anunnaki do not cause endings. They acknowledge them. This distinction is crucial and deeply uncomfortable, because it means there is no enemy to defeat, no revelation to uncover, no secret technology to steal, only acceptance to achieve. And acceptance does not sell. It does not thrill. It does not go viral, so it is replaced. The modern Anunnaki myth is not born from tablets. It is born from anxiety. Anxiety about meaning, about insignificance, about limits that cannot be overcome. Ancient astronaut theory answers a different question than the one Sumerians asked. The Sumerians asked, how does order persist? Modern humanity asks, how can we escape? These are incompatible questions, which is why the answers conflict. To the Sumerian, the idea of beings arriving from the sky to change fate would be terrifying, not inspiring, because it would destabilize order. It would reintroduce unpredictability. It would undo the hard-won balance between life and death. The Anunnaki were feared precisely because they did not interfere. Their restraint preserved reality. Intervention was what caused floods, what triggered resets, what destroyed cities. Why would one want more of that? Modern narratives misunderstand ancient silence as absence. But silence was design. The gods withdrew because proximity caused damage. The flood myth is a warning, not a miracle. Too much divine involvement ends worlds. So gods retreat. Systems remain. Humans manage themselves. This is not abandonment. It is maturation. The Anunnaki fade because they are no longer needed daily. Judgment is automatic. Death is universal. Order sustains itself. This is why later myths feel louder, more dramatic, more emotional. They compensate for lost proximity. They invent narratives where gods argue, love, rage, forgive, because those gods are no longer felt. The Sumerian gods were not comforting. They were functional, and function does not inspire devotion. It inspires compliance, which modern audiences mistake for oppression. But oppression implies injustice. The Sumerian system was not unjust. It was indifferent. Indifference is harder to accept because it offers no moral leverage. You cannot negotiate with indifference. You cannot persuade it. You can only adapt. And adaptation is not heroic. It is practical. Which brings us back to the Anunnaki. They are not villains. They are not creators. They are not visitors. They are constraints personified. They exist to remind humanity that life is finite, that order outlasts individuals, that the universe does not bend to desire, and that meaning must be constructed locally, here, now, before silence. This is why the original Sumerian texts feel calm, even when describing catastrophe, because catastrophe is not failure. It is part of operation. Floods reset systems. Death recycles presence. Memory extends relevance. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is saved. Everything moves. This worldview does not promise comfort. It promises continuity. And continuity is quieter than hope, which is why modern retellings drown it out. They replace inevitability with spectacle, judges with engineers, order with conspiracy. But when the spectacle fades, the old questions return. Why do we die? Why does memory matter? Why does order persist without justice? The Sumerians answered these questions without illusion, and the Anunnaki were the answer, not as beings, but as boundaries. When modern readers ask what existed before the Anunnaki, the question itself reveals a misunderstanding. It assumes escalation. More power, more knowledge, more beings, more complexity. But the Sumerian texts point in the opposite direction. What came before the Anunnaki was not an advanced stage. It was a simpler one. Before judgment, there was no need for judges. Before fate, there was no need for decrees. Before death became structured, there was no need for administrators of the dead. The Anunnaki do not appear at the beginning of existence. They appear when existence becomes crowded. They emerge not from creation, but from management. In the earliest layers of Sumerian thought, there is no divine court. There is no underworld assembly. There is only water, undifferentiated, endless. Nammu. This is not a god in the later sense. It is a condition, a state where nothing is separated enough to require regulation. No sky distinct from earth. No living distinct from dead. No human distinct from divine. In that state, nothing needs judgment. Nothing needs to end. Nothing needs to be sorted. The emergence of the cosmos is not described as invention. It is described as separation. Heaven pulled away from earth. Breath inserted between. Boundaries drawn. Once boundaries exist, things can cross them. Once things cross them, order must be enforced. The Anunnaki arise at that point, not as creators, but as stabilizers. They are not present when reality is unified. They become necessary only when reality fragments. This means the pre-Anunnaki world is not superior. It is unfinished, unlivable. There are no cities in the primordial sea, no memory, no continuity, no identity, just potential. The Sumerians did not romanticize this state. They did not long to return to it. The flood is terrifying precisely because it temporarily restores that condition. Water everywhere. Boundaries erased. Cities dissolved. Names lost. The flood is not purification. It is regression. And after it passes, order must be rebuilt. Judgment must be reestablished. Limits must be enforced again. The Anunnaki's role becomes permanent only after this lesson. Before the flood, boundaries were soft. Lifespans were long. Gods walked closer. Humanity multiplied without restraint. The result was instability, noise, collapse. So the system hardens. Lifespans shorten. Boundaries thicken. Judgment becomes final. The Anunnaki sit. From this point on, there is no return to the primordial state. Not because it is forbidden, but because it is unworkable. This is why Sumerian texts do not glorify origins. They do not speak nostalgically of the beginning. The beginning is dangerous. Order is achievement. The Anunnaki represent the achievement of order, which is why they are not active heroes. They are endpoints, markers. They exist so that nothing spills back into chaos. Modern narratives invert this logic. They imagine the beginning as advanced. They imagine the present as fallen. They imagine salvation as return. But Sumerian cosmology rejects this entirely. Progress is not technological. It is structural. The movement is from potential to stability, from closeness to distance, from immediacy to mediation, from divine presence to procedural order. And the Anunnaki are the final mediators. They ensure that life does not bleed indefinitely into death, that names do not pile endlessly, that existence cycles. This worldview has no nostalgia for Eden, no lost paradise. Dilmun is not origin. It is exception, a holding space, removed from the system, and only one human is allowed there, because widespread exception breaks order. This again contradicts modern longing. We want the exception to expand. The Sumerians contained it. One immortal, one witness, removed, silent. Utnapishtim is not savior. He is evidence. Evidence that the system once malfunctioned, and that it will not be allowed to do so again. This is why immortality is never democratized, never ritualized, never repeated. It is a scar in the cosmology, not a promise. The Anunnaki exist to ensure no more scars appear. Which brings us to a quiet realization. The Sumerians were not obsessed with gods. They were obsessed with containment. Containing water, containing death, containing memory, containing power, containing population, containing chaos. The gods were tools of containment. The Anunnaki were the final seal. And seals do not need stories. They need to hold. This is why they feel empty to modern readers, why they lack personality, why they resist dramatization. They were never meant to be loved or feared in the moment. They were meant to be trusted to end things properly, which is far more unsettling. When the gods grew distant, something else grew stronger. Not belief, not faith, structure. The Sumerian temple was never just a place of worship. It was a machine. A slow, methodical engine designed to keep the world from slipping backward. Every major city was organized around it. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur. At the center stood the temple complex, elevated above the plain, visible from every approach. Not because it was sacred in the emotional sense, but because it was central in the functional sense. The temple managed grain. It tracked livestock. It employed workers. It redistributed food. It preserved records. It synchronized ritual with season. This was not religion as comfort. It was religion as infrastructure. The gods no longer walked among humans, but their presence was assumed to persist through systems. If the temple functioned, the god was present. If the temple failed, the god weakened. Divinity was no longer personal. It was operational. This is a crucial transition. Early myths described gods acting directly, separating heaven and earth, unleashing floods, shaping humanity with clay. Later, reality required something else. Maintenance. The MI, those divine principles governing kingship, justice, craft, sexuality, labor, war, were not abstract laws. They were procedures, ways of doing things correctly, ways of keeping the machine aligned. Each ritual performed correctly reinforced the system. Each ritual neglected weakened it. This is why precision mattered more than emotion. A ritual done joyfully but incorrectly failed. A ritual done mechanically but accurately succeeded. This is alien to modern spirituality. But it made sense in a world where chaos was always one flood away. The Anunnaki do not appear in these daily operations. They do not supervise rituals. They do not intervene when mistakes occur. They are downstream. They receive what results. If order fails long enough, the consequences accumulate. Famine, disease, collapse, eventually death. Only then does judgment occur. The Anunnaki are not micromanagers. They are auditors. And auditors do not guide. They record. This explains why Sumerian religion feels impersonal, why prayers often sound contractual, why offerings resemble accounting entries. The gods were not lovers or confessors. They were stakeholders. A city that failed its obligations risked losing protection, not as punishment, as consequence. The temple economy reinforced this logic. Workers received rations based on role. Priests were fed. Scribes were fed. Laborers were fed. Everyone was tracked. Everyone was counted. Not because humans were devalued, but because uncounted humans disappear. And disappearance was the greatest threat. The Anunnaki presided over disappearance. The temple prevented it. Together, they formed a closed loop. Life was maintained above. Death was managed below. Between them, order persisted. This system did not require constant divine speech. It required compliance, participation, continuity, and that is why it endured for centuries without collapse into mythic chaos. The Sumerians did not imagine an ending filled with revelation. No final unveiling. No sudden clarity. No moment where everything made sense at once. Their ending was quieter than that. And because it was quiet, it was trusted. When a Sumerian imagined the end of life, they did not imagine judgment as spectacle. They imagined arrival. Arrival in a place already prepared, already occupied, already ordered. Kur was not chaos, it was routine. Dust, shadow, silence. Not punishment, not reward, just continuation in reduced form. The dead did not suffer. They diminished. And this mattered, because suffering implies injustice. Diminishment implies transition. The Anunnaki did not torment the dead. They processed them. They ensured that the living and the dead did not collapse into each other. This separation was mercy. Without it, grief would never resolve. Loss would never settle. Memory would suffocate presence. So the dead were moved away, filed, contained, and life continued. This expectation shaped how the Sumerians lived. They did not live for transcendence. They lived for completion, to complete one's role, to fulfill one's function, to leave behind something stable, a child, a wall, a tablet, a field. This is why the Sumerian king does not seek heaven. He seeks order. He repairs canals. He adjudicates disputes. He builds temples. His success is measured not by divine visions, but by continuity. Does the city endure? Does the harvest return? Does the calendar remain accurate? These are sacred questions, because they indicate alignment with the cosmic system. The Anunnaki are never invoked for personal miracles. They are invoked for final accounting. Their presence is felt not in prayer, but in inevitability. And inevitability produces calm. This is difficult for modern minds to grasp. We associate inevitability with despair. The Sumerians associated it with relief, because unpredictability was terrifying. A god who might intervene at any moment was dangerous. A god who never intervened was reliable. The Anunnaki never interrupt life. They wait for it to conclude. This waiting is their power, and their restraint is their virtue. As centuries passed, this quiet expectation persisted, even as cultures changed. The names shifted, the languages evolved, but the structure remained. Death is not a failure. It is completion. Judgment is not moral. It is procedural. Meaning is not bestowed. It is constructed. And memory is the only extension permitted. This is why Sumerian texts do not end with hope. They end with return. Return to the city. Return to the wall. Return to the field. Return to record. Even Gilgamesh ends not with enlightenment, but with measurement. He counts stones. He describes foundations. He turns outward, because inward revelation did not save him. Only outward construction remained. This is the ending the Sumerians expected. No cosmic rescue, no second chance, no rewritten fate. Just a quiet closing of the account, and then silence. Modern humanity resists this. We want the ending to justify the struggle, to redeem suffering, to promise more. We imagine continuation without diminishment, life without cost, existence without limit. And so we rewrite ancient endings. We turn judges into invaders. We turn administrators into engineers. We turn boundaries into conspiracies. Because conspiracies can be solved, boundaries cannot. But the Sumerian worldview does not bend. It waits. Just like the Anunnaki. It does not argue, it does not persuade, it does not adapt. It simply remains coherent. And coherence is its strength. When stripped of spectacle, what remains is a civilization that understood something we struggle to accept. That meaning does not come from escaping the system. It comes from functioning within it. That death is not an enemy. It is a condition. That gods are not saviors. They are stabilizers. And that the universe does not owe us explanation, only structure. The Anunnaki never arrived. They were always there. Not watching, not plotting, not intervening. Just ensuring that when life ends, it ends cleanly. And that after the final breath, nothing spills back into chaos. This is not a comforting story, but it is an honest one. And honesty endures longer than hope. Once immortality was removed from reach, something else took its place. Not hope. Memory. In Sumerian culture, to be forgotten was worse than to die. Death was inevitable. Forgetting was optional, and responsibility for memory belonged to the living. This is why lineage mattered so intensely. Why sons were prized. Why names were repeated across generations. Why kings inscribed their deeds obsessively. Why even ordinary people sought to appear in records. A name pressed into clay resisted erasure. It lingered, long after breath ended. The underworld offered no reward, but memory offered presence. A remembered person still participated in the world, through offerings, through spoken names, through rituals, through inheritance. The dead depended on the living, not emotionally, structurally. Without offerings, the dead weakened. Without memory, they faded. The Anunnaki did not prevent this. They allowed it. They judged the dead, but they did not sustain them. Sustenance came from remembrance. This placed an enormous ethical weight on descendants. To forget was not merely disrespect, it was annihilation. This is why Sumerian texts emphasize continuity over individuality. You mattered because you belonged to a line, to a house, to a city. Your value was not in uniqueness. It was in transmission. What did you pass on? A field? A skill? A name? A functioning canal? A stable city? This is the origin of legacy thinking, not ego. Responsibility. The Anunnaki made immortality impossible so that memory would matter. If everyone lived forever, memory would lose urgency. Names would blur. Lineage would dissolve. History would stagnate. By enforcing death, the Anunnaki preserved narrative, and narrative preserved meaning. This is the deepest irony of the system. Death was not the enemy of meaning. It was the engine of it. Modern culture reverses this. We chase personal immortality, digital records, endless archives. But without ritual, memory becomes noise. Sumerian memory was curated, maintained, actively renewed. A name spoken mattered more than a name stored. This is why tablets were not enough. Ritual had to accompany record. Offerings had to accompany memory. Without action, remembrance decayed. The Anunnaki presided silently over this exchange. They did not intervene. They did not enforce remembrance. They simply processed what arrived, and what arrived depended on the living. This is the final burden humanity carries in the Sumerian worldview. Not salvation, not enlightenment. Responsibility for continuity. And when continuity failed, the system did not collapse. It absorbed the loss, judged it, closed the account, moved on. There is a moment in the Sumerian worldview that is easy to miss. It is not marked by catastrophe. There is no flood, no divine decree, no dramatic withdrawal. It is quieter than that. It is the moment when the gods stop doing things. They do not vanish. They do not die. They simply stop intervening. The world does not collapse when this happens. That is the point. The canals still fill. The seasons still turn. Children are still born. People still die. Which forces a difficult realization. The gods were never holding the world together directly. They were holding the framework. And once the framework existed, it could continue without constant touch. This is the transition from mythic time to live time, from divine action to human responsibility, from creation to maintenance. The Sumerians did not frame this as abandonment, they framed it as inheritance. The world had been structured, boundaries had been set, roles defined, consequences established. Now humans were expected to operate within that structure, not freely, not creatively, but carefully. This is why later Sumerian texts focus less on creation myths and more on laws, hymns, contracts, and rituals. Because once the universe is built, the real challenge begins. Keeping it from breaking. The gods had done the dangerous work, separating heaven and earth, introducing death, limiting lifespan, installing judgment. After that, intervention became risk, not help. Too much divine action destabilized reality. The flood proved that. So the gods receded, and humanity remained. Alone, but not unsupported, because structure remained. The calendar still regulated time. The temple still anchored the city. The king still embodied order. The MI still governed behavior. And the Anunnaki still waited at the end. This waiting is crucial. The Anunnaki do not guide humanity. They do not correct mistakes. They do not prevent suffering. They only ensure closure, which means everything between birth and death is unmanaged. This terrifies modern readers, but to the Sumerians, it was the only way life could function. If gods corrected every error, humans would never learn alignment. If gods intervened constantly, the system would never stabilize. So humans learned to read signs instead. A failed harvest meant misalignment. A flood meant neglected boundaries. A plague meant imbalance. The question was never, why did the gods do this? The question was, what failed? This produced a culture obsessed with precision, with ritual correctness, with record keeping. With repetition? Because repetition maintained alignment. Change introduced risk. This is why innovation in Sumer is cautious, gradual, layered. Because the system was fragile, and fragility demanded respect. The king embodied this responsibility. He was not divine. He was accountable. Chosen by the gods, yes, but also replaceable. If the city failed, the king failed. Not morally, functionally. This is why kings boasted about building walls, digging canals, restoring temples. Not about visions, not about revelations. Infrastructure was holiness, because infrastructure preserved order, and order preserved life. The Anunnaki stood outside all of this, uninvolved, unmoved. Their stillness was what made responsibility real. If judgment waited, then choices mattered. If death was certain, then timing mattered. If nothing was forgiven automatically, then precision mattered. This is the weight the Sumerians carried. Not guilt, not sin, responsibility. And responsibility does not comfort. It steadies. It anchors. It demands attention. This is why Sumerian religion feels emotionally distant. It was never meant to soothe. It was meant to stabilize. And stabilization requires restraint. The gods withdrew so the world could function. The Anunnaki waited so the world could end properly. Between those two truths, humanity lived, worked, built, remembered, forgot, and the world endured. There is no moment when the world realizes it is ending. That is perhaps the most difficult truth the Sumerians accepted. Endings do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with sound. They do not pause the sky or darken the sun. They occur quietly, while everything else continues. A field still ripples in the wind. A river still follows its course. A city still hums with movement. And somewhere within that continuity, a life closes. Not with significance, with completion. This is the ending the Sumerians expected. Not a conclusion to history, not a revelation of purpose, but a return to stillness. They understood that the universe does not observe individuals. It does not slow for grief. It does not recalibrate for loss, which is why meaning could never be external. It had to be embedded in action, in maintenance, in participation. The Anunnaki do not gather dramatically at the end of a life. There is no assembly scene, no dialogue, no weighing of deeds against ideals. The dead arrive. They are received. They are processed. This is not cruelty. It is consistency. Consistency is what makes the system survivable. If death were unpredictable, life would be unbearable. If judgment were emotional, order would collapse. So the Anunnaki remain unchanged. They do not age. They do not evolve. They do not soften. And because of that, the living can function without fear of surprise. The Sumerians did not seek comfort from the gods. They sought reliability. A universe that behaves consistently, even harshly, is preferable to one that changes its rules. This is why there is no rebellion myth against death, no story of humans overthrowing fate, no divine apology for mortality. Even thy gods submit. Inanna dies, Enkidu dies, kings die. The system does not bend for anyone, and this universality is what makes it bearable. No one is singled out. No one is spared unfairly. No one is punished uniquely. Everything that lives ends, and everything that ends is absorbed. The underworld is not a destination. It is a function, a place where excess presence is reduced, where noise dissipates, where motion stills. This is not a moral failure. It is a mechanical necessity. Without reduction, the world would choke on itself. The flood taught this lesson violently. Death teaches it continuously. The Anunnaki ensure it happens cleanly. They do not interfere with life. They do not influence decisions. They wait. Waiting is their power, because waiting creates finality, and finality gives shape to existence. A life without an ending is shapeless, meaningless. Infinite continuation erases contrast, erases urgency, erases care. The Sumerians understood this intuitively, which is why they did not chase immortality. They feared it. Immortality would break the system. It would collapse lineage, overcrowd memory, stagnate change. The one immortal human, Utnapishtim, is removed, exiled from society, placed at the edge of the world, not rewarded, contained, because exception must be isolated, or it infects the structure. This is the discipline of Sumerian thought. Exception is dangerous. Miracles are destabilizing. Intervention is risky. Consistency preserves. This worldview does not inspire awe. It inspires endurance. The Sumerians did not expect the world to love them. They expected it to continue. And that expectation shaped everything. Their laws, their cities, their writing, their myths, their silence. The Anunnaki are not symbols of oppression. They are symbols of closure. They exist so that nothing lingers unfinished, so that no presence overwhelms the system, so that life can proceed without being haunted by what refuses to end. This is why the dead must be fed through ritual, not because they are powerful, but because they are weak, fading, dependent. Memory sustains them briefly, then even memory thins, and eventually nothing remains. Not even a name. This was not tragic to the Sumerians. It was expected. Tragedy implies injustice. This was process. The universe did not promise remembrance. Humans created it. And when it failed, the system absorbed the loss. The Anunnaki did not protest. They did not grieve. They recorded. And recording is the last kindness, because it acknowledges existence without prolonging it. As time passed, later cultures replaced this silence with narrative. They added heavens, rewards, punishments, moral reckonings, because silence frightened them. But silence was the Sumerian answer. Not emptiness, stillness. Stillness after motion, rest after function. The clay tablet does not speak once it is fired. It holds. That is enough. The world continues like that tablet, imprinted, hardened, carried forward, eventually broken, fragments scattered, meaning thins, but pattern persists, and pattern does not need belief. It does not require attention. It operates regardless. The Sumerians lived inside that pattern. They did not try to escape it. They did not imagine themselves as central. They understood themselves as temporary, which allowed them to build things that lasted longer than they did. Cities, calendars, stories. Even now, their words survive in fragments, pressed into clay by hands that understood impermanence, hands that did not expect to be remembered, and yet were. Briefly, that is the final irony. Meaning emerges not from demand, but from acceptance. The Anunnaki do not come at the end of the story. They were there before it began. They will be there after it ends. They are not watching. They are not waiting for recognition. They simply remain, because something must, and everything else passes. The ending arrives without announcement. A breath slows, the body stills. The world does not pause. The river moves, the field breathes. The city hums. And somewhere, the system closes one more account. Quietly. Completely. Without notice. And that is how it has always worked. There is no signal that tells the world a life has ended. No change in the sky. No pause in the movement of the river. No alteration in the path of the stars. The world continues exactly as it did before, And this, to the Sumerians, was not indifference. It was confirmation. They believed the universe did not respond to individual endings because it could not afford to. If the world stopped for every death, nothing would ever move forward. So it does not stop. It absorbs. A body stills. Breath fades. Warmth leaves. And everything beyond that moment proceeds uninterrupted. Fields continue to breathe in the wind. Animals move across the plain. Water presses forward, following channels carved generations earlier by hands long turned to dust. The city does not notice. The system does. This is where the Anunnaki belong. Not at the moment of death, but just after. Not as witnesses, but as confirmation. They do not observe the living. They receive the finished. In Sumerian thought, a life is not something to be evaluated. It is something to be completed. Once complete, it must be placed where completed things belong. Not elevated, not preserved, not punished, just placed. The underworld was not imagined as darkness, because darkness is evil. It was imagined as darkness, because nothing there needs to be seen. Nothing there needs to act. Nothing there needs to change. It is a place of stillness, because motion has already occurred, and motion, once finished, has no reason to continue. This understanding shaped how the Sumerians viewed existence itself. Life was not sacred because it was eternal. It was sacred because it was temporary. Every action mattered because it could not be repeated indefinitely. Every season mattered because it would not always return for you. Every relationship mattered because it would eventually end. The Anunnaki did not diminish meaning. They intensified it. Because knowing there is no extension beyond death sharpens attention within life. This is why the Sumerians did not waste language on speculation about the afterlife. They did not imagine reward or punishment beyond vague continuation. The real weight was here, in the present, in the city, in the work, in the maintenance of order. They believed chaos was not dramatic. It was slow, neglectful, quiet, a canal not dredged, a ritual skipped, a record left incomplete. These were the beginnings of collapse, not rebellion, not defiance, forgetting. This is why memory mattered more than belief. A god remembered was a god present. A dead ancestor remembered was a dead ancestor sustained. But memory required effort, active repetition, names spoken, offerings placed, stories retold. Without that effort, everything faded. Even gods, even kings, even cities. The Anunnaki did not prevent this fading. They oversaw it. They ensured that fading did not reverse, that nothing lingered too long, that nothing disrupted the balance by refusing to end. This refusal to end was the greatest danger imaginable. It would clog the system, overwhelm the living, collapse continuity. So endings were protected, not avoided. The Sumerians did not romanticize permanence. They distrusted it. Anything that lasted forever became dangerous. Only systems were allowed endurance. Not individuals, not empires, not even gods in their active forms. Everything that moved was meant to stop. Everything that stopped was meant to be processed. And everything processed made space for what came next. This was the quiet logic behind everything. The Anunnaki were not gods of fear. They were gods of clearance. They cleared the world of what could no longer participate, so participation could continue. This is why the Sumerian universe feels calm even in its harshness, because nothing is arbitrary, nothing is personal, nothing is wasted. A life ends because all lives must. A city falls because all cities will. A civilization fades because continuity requires renewal. Even the Sumerians knew they would not last forever. They did not try to. They built knowing others would inherit. They wrote knowing others would read imperfectly. They accepted distortion, accepted forgetting, accepted that even the Anunnaki would one day be misunderstood. That did not trouble them, because misunderstanding does not break structure. Only refusal does, and refusal is brief. The world absorbs it. This is why the end of the story is not dramatic. There is no final judgment scene, no last declaration, no voice explaining what it all meant. Meaning was never universal. It was local, temporary, constructed, and then released. The Anunnaki do not speak at the end. They never did. Silence is their language, because silence allows everything else to continue. A story that ends loudly leaves no space. A story that fades allows sleep. The Sumerians understood this, which is why their myths dissolve instead of conclude, why their epics return to walls and measurements, why their gods sit instead of act, why their afterlife does not redeem, why their universe does not explain itself. The ending is not absence, it is rest. Rest after function, stillness after motion, balance after accumulation. The world does not notice when the final breath leaves a body, but the system does. And once acknowledged, the world moves on, as it must, as it always has, quietly, slowly, without asking to be understood. And somewhere beneath the surface, beneath memory, beneath language, beneath belief, the structure holds. Nothing arrives, nothing departs, everything completes, and then gently releases.